Everyone, thank you for coming out on a nice balmy morning in the nation's capital. I hope everyone is nice and toasty warm in here. I feel like every time I come down to DC for one of these events, there's some strange weather thing happening, and today is no exception to that. I'm Ben White, Politico's chief economic correspondent. Write the Morning Money newsletter, which I hope all of you read. If you don't, you should, and remedy that immediately. I'd like to thank everyone also who's here on the live stream. We're delighted to have North Carolina Congressman Patrick McHenry joining us today. He's the Chief Deputy Whip in the House, also on the House Financial Services Committee, Chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. So we'll have an interesting discussion with him. I'd like to encourage folks in the audience and on the live stream to join the conversation under hashtag Morning Money if you have questions for the Congressman. I've got a tablet here on stage and we'll take some of your questions. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the Peter G. Peterson Foundation for their partnership on these Morning Money events. And here to say a few words is Michael Peterson, Foundation's President and Chief Operating Officer.
Thank you, Ben. On behalf of the Peterson Foundation, good morning and welcome, and thank you for coming. Peterson Foundation is a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to increase awareness and accelerate action on America's long-term fiscal challenges. And while recent deficits have been lower, America still faces structural challenges over the long term and in the coming decades. And our focus is to drive progress towards solutions that build a solid fiscal foundation to ensure long-term economic growth. As part of that mission, we bring people together for meaningful policy discussions and exchange of ideas. So we're very pleased to be a sponsor of today's Morning Money Breakfast. Today's discussion, of course, comes on the heels of the midterm election, and as we look toward a busy and interesting lame duck session, whether it's annual appropriations, tax extenders, or physician payments, there are a range of important policy deadlines coming up that have a long-term fiscal implication as well as near-term economic implication. This morning's guest will be right in the thick of the debate for the House Republicans. As Chief Deputy Whip and a member of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman McHenry is a leading voice on these important issues. I'm very much looking forward to his thoughts on what we can achieve in the lame duck session and in the new Congress. Lastly, once again, thank you to Ben White and Politico for your excellent moderation of these important policy discussions and bringing these important issues to America. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Without further ado, let's bring in Congressman Patrick McHenry.
Good
morning, sir.
Thanks. Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Happy to.
Appreciate it. I'm told you're a big Beyonce fan. We should have had a Beyonce song to welcome you in. We'll have one for the way out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not a Solange fan.
Not a Solange fan. I see.
No,
right.
especially not in elevators.
Yeah, she had a bit of an issue there. Let's start with the issue that's sort of on everybody's mind right now, and that is presuming we get a unilateral executive action on immigration reform soon, perhaps as soon as Friday, that gives legal status to up to 5 million, perhaps more, currently undocumented immigrants in the United States. What is the House Republican reaction to that going to be, and can you respond to the president in a way that doesn't lead to a government shutdown? Can you fund the government past December 11th into the next Congress, even if Obama acts unilaterally on immigration reform in the coming days?
Yes.
Okay. No government shutdown.
No.
You can guarantee us that.
I can't guarantee much of anything. I'm one of 435. But you asked my prediction. We're not going to have a government shutdown. We're going to fund the government. And what you're going to see is, as the Speaker said, all options are on the table. We have to have discussions within the House Republican Conference to figure out the pathway forward. We will have to act, and the American people want us to act. If you look at all the polling, if you look at even President Obama's comments over the past 3 years on this subject matter, he said, I'm not an emperor, I'm not a king. He's gone into elaborate detail about how he cannot take the action that he's apparently going to take. And with the questions that are swirling around the globe about security, for the president to focus on this, it seems to me much more about politics and trying to play a strategic game with the House Republicans. We're not going to take the bait. We're not going to take the bait. And I think what the president is trying to get us and goad us into is a government shutdown. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to act responsibly, and this debate about immigration will continue on, but you're going to see responsible actions from House Republicans.
And what does that responsible action look like? How do you respond to the president in a way that doesn't lead to a government shutdown? What does that response look like the day after the immigration action is taken by the president?
Well, there are a number of options on the table, not just about a CR and omnibus. In this question of December 11th on keeping the government open, there are larger ways to approach this. First of all, the Senate has an obligation here. When the Attorney General is the implementer of this executive order, and you have an Attorney General nominee before the Senate, certainly Senate Republicans should ask questions, and responsible Democrats should ask questions of this Attorney General on whether or not, or this Attorney General nominee, on whether or not she will implement this executive order, even if it is counter to law. I would also point out that it's clear, the Wall Street Journal editorial the other day, it mentions that the president did not seek advice from the Office of Legal Counsel, as he's done on numerous things, as presidents traditionally do, about the legality of certain actions. He has not sought that advice about this question of executive amnesty, which shows that he believes, not just the 3 or 4 interviews where he said that he can't take these actions, but it's clear by his actions that there's sort of dubious legality that he's working under.
Are you suggesting that the Senate should hold up the confirmation of the Attorney General if Obama moves on immigration, and if she says in her confirmation hearings that she would enforce the actions that he takes?
I think that is a worthy discussion for Senate Republicans to have.
Okay. And on funding the government, should we look for a short-term measure that gets us into January and simply moves the discussion over the length of time of a funding resolution? Should we look for a short-term CR to get us into January, or can you still, in this short period of time, given that I assume you're going out on Friday for Thanksgiving, you're back for 10 days, in that 10-day period, can you get a bill through that would fund the government through the end of the fiscal year next year, take the risk of a shutdown off the back of the economy?
Well, both options are on the table, and we've not determined the path forward. We have to see what the president's going to do and when he's going to do it. I was sitting there as Senator Landrieu after yesterday's vote on the Keystone Pipeline, with the president taking action like this, potentially, before her runoff. It seems like they've written her off in terms of being reelected to the Senate, which is pretty fascinating to see them cut her off like that. So I think this question of executive amnesty has some very practical political consequences in the short term for Democrats. And I think the American people will react strongly in opposition to it. The question is, what can we do responsibly to hold this president accountable? I think that in January, our policy options are much more enhanced. So even if we fund the government, we can have a rescissions package in January, February, March, April, for any time for the remainder of the fiscal year, and put that rescissions package through the House, the Senate, and put it on the president's desk, and make him determine whether or not he's going to support responsible changes or stick with his executive amnesty.
I want to ask you about the aspirations of the Republican leadership seem to be, and are on the record, as avoiding shutdowns, avoiding fiscal cliffs, avoiding the kind of train wrecks we've seen in the past from Capitol Hill that have slowed down the economy significantly. That seems an aspirational hope to me, and not yet demonstrated by the ability to bring the rank and file along. You sort of occupy an interesting spot in that you come from the South, you're a conservative Republican, but at the same time you voted last time around to end the government shutdown in sort of an emissary role to the conservative caucus of the House Republicans, and at the same time, as part of leadership, pushing forward this agenda to end the era of train wrecks and shutdowns. Can you bring the conservative caucus along? Will they say, okay, we'll fund the government with the promise that we can push back on immigration reform later? Is it reasonable to think that you can get this kind of thing through the House, and that you can enact this new policy of governance and leadership that doesn't create shutdowns and debt ceiling crises?
We'll see.
We'll see. That's your prediction. You don't sound super confident that you can do
Well,
that.
look, basically, the focus on Washington has been on House Republicans. We have a president who refuses to lead when it comes to fiscal policy matters. He has been pulled along when it comes to even the authorization of military force against ISIL. He's been pulled along when it comes to budget agreements. He's been pulled along on legislating. He won't even come to the table for responsible changes to a signature legislative item on Obamacare. He refuses to accept a single change to Dodd-Frank, so he says, so his Treasury Secretary says. This is not all about House Republicans. Right. And what we'll see come January is both the House and Senate working as much together as possible to actually put good legislation on this president's desk and make him make a choice. And I think the question of Keystone failing under a Democrat Senate and Mary Landrieu failing when it comes to that job, that will change in January when we have a new Republican Senate and we can take that bill and put it before the president and make him make a decision.
Yep. I want to ask you, before we turn to some specific things on the House Financial Services Committee and issues that you face about the debt limit, because no one's talking about it now, but it's going to come up again in the spring, the need to raise it again to avoid the possibility of default. One imagines that Republicans in both the House and the Senate are going to want some type of fiscal deal in return for raising the debt limit that cuts spending, that perhaps addresses entitlements in some way. What can you tell us about what the Republican caucus will want in return for a debt ceiling increase? And should Wall Street be worried that we're once again going to get close to a deadline on the debt limit? Who knows how long Treasury has with extraordinary measures this time around, but we will get to that point where we need to raise it. What do Republicans want in return for a debt limit increase in the spring?
Well, we're working first, the discussion is really not about spring or summer with the debt limit. The question is responsible fiscal measures between now and then. That means we have to pass a budget and have a budget that passes through the House and the Senate, and then we conference and reconcile our differences there. And then we have an operational document, not just for the next fiscal year, or for the next 2 fiscal years, which is all that we've been able to get under the current regime with the Senate. But what are those measures that we can put in place for a longer-term budget document? Once we establish those guiding principles in March with our budget resolution, then that sets the stage for negotiating with the president when it comes to the debt limit. Now, certainly every president's had to give when it comes to the debt limit. Every president's done that. George W. Bush did it. Bill Clinton did it. This has been a traditional lever in order to get some compromises done. But if we have a budget resolution, you can then have reconciliation instructions that deal with the question of the debt limit. So we'll be able to set that stage and actually send a clear signal to Wall Street that we have responsible budgeting coming from the Congress. And the pressure will be less on House Republicans and Senate Republicans and more on the president to come to the table to have some longer range agreement for debt and deficits. Now, that final component of the president coming to the table is much more aspirational. Because
now you're stealing my words.
Right, there you go. Yeah. Aspirational, right? Mm-hmm. And because we haven't seen this president come to the table. He sent Biden up to do the fiscal cliff deal, and then is frustrated when Biden wants to be a bridge when it comes to immigration. So, you know, we haven't seen consistent policy.
I mean, I'm sure the White House would argue that they did come to the table in 2011 and had a deal they thought was on the table and then had the goalposts moved on them. I don't want to relitigate this who moved the goalposts when issue, but I think the pushback to that would be that he did try to make a deal with Boehner, a longer-term grand compromise, and couldn't do it. Should we expect that the conditions will be different to allow that kind of deal-making this time around?
Well, I think the conditions are certainly different. The president has lost both the House and the Senate, and had a fairly substantial rebuke at the last election. So maybe the president has a change of heart on this.
Do you think, speaking of the midterm elections, do you think the president gets the message from those, the results of that election and the loss of the Senate and historic House majority. It seems like his reaction to that has been to double down on environmental policies, immigration reform, and decide that he's going to take unilateral action. Do you think he gets it? What happened?
It's not immigration reform he's doubling down on. It's immigration shenanigans. This is not even responsible reform. And this doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't make things better for the American people, and does not give certainty to immigrants and those that want to come to this country. I think it's a disaster.
Why do you think it's a disaster? And what would you do for those, I mean, just to defend the White House position on this a bit, in that, you have a lot of millions of people who are in this country now who are unsure of their circumstance, and what would you do for those people who don't want to be separated from their families and, in many cases have legitimate claims to stay and be productive members of our society? What's your response? What would you do for them?
Well, first of all, the president had unprecedented majorities in the House and the Senate for the first 2 years of his term. And he did squat on immigration. He did nothing on immigration. Nothing. And so for him to take this issue and blame it on Republicans when he had unrivaled majorities in the House and the Senate. They had 60 votes in the Senate. Which we haven't seen a more ideologically aligned party have a 60-vote majority in generations in the United States Senate. And they took up immigration not at all.
So the Senate's now passed an immigration reform bill. Why can't the House pass it?
Well, because we can't pass large omnibus bills like that. These sort of large, all-encompassing bills that the Senate cobbles together and everybody says it stinks, but they vote for it. In the House, everybody says it stinks and they vote against it. So what I think we have to do is have some certainty when it comes to border security and border entry. And we have legislation we produced and come through House committees that deal with border security issues and border entry issues. I think that's the first step for any discussion about immigration. Then we have to clean up the process by which people come here legally. Our immigration services that process the paperwork for immigrants to come here, up until 2005, used Windows 95 with a DOS prompt. There's a reason why we have an illegal immigration problem, because we have a government that's incompetent in even processing and giving certainty to those that want to come here. So we have to clean up that. We have to clean up that service. And in doing so, we're going to have to readjust the numbers of folks that we allow from different countries. And in the blessing of your birth, it determines whether or not you can actually come to this country as an immigrant. So if you're born into a country where not many people immigrate to the United States, it's easy. And if there's a strong desire to come to the United States from other countries, it may never happen for you. That's not responsible. That's not right. So in addition to what I've talked about there, we have legislation when it comes to high-tech visas. There are a number of small pieces that cobbled together actually make a huge impact when it comes to immigration. Then this question of status and citizenship, that has got to be the last discussion in this whole process. The president wants to make that first, and that's much more about politics than what is responsible for immigration for the long term, and certainty for immigrants that are here legally in the United States, and certainty for the American people to know that we have a competent government that's enforcing their laws.
Let's move on for a bit to the House Financial Services Committee and another deadline that you've got, and that is reauthorization of TRIA. Runs out, the terrorism insurance runs out December 31st. Can you get something done with the Senate before the expiration date at the end of the year?
Yes.
Okay, what's it look like? And how do you do it?
So, first of all, just for context, I voted for what is existing law for TRIA. And so I think TRIA is a very important program. For certainty, for commercial real estate in particular. And it's not simply about Manhattan or Chicago or LA. This is about middle market America and something as simple as a shopping mall. It's not all about the greatest towers in the world. This is about the rest of the country as well, and providing some certainty for our insurance markets and property owners. So I think it has to get done. And we do not need a gap, and we don't. And a 6-month extension is not responsible either. So what I think it looks like is something higher than what the Senate passed in terms of the trigger, and to some degree a look at bifurcation and to see how that would work in the marketplace. I think a few small changes and we could pass this thing and get it to the president's desk.
Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the committee in the next Congress. Chairman Henserling obviously will return as chairman. Will you be vice chair in the next committee and have those discussions taken place? Will you be the number two man?
I've had initial conversations with Jeb, but still need to finish those things out. I'm currently a subcommittee chair on oversight, but I have a new responsibility with being chief deputy whip. So.
You could probably balance both of those things, right? You're a young man with energy. You could be the vice chair and the deputy chief deputy whip, right? You seem.
We'll see what Jeb thinks.
Okay, I gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about coordination between House Financial Services. Now you'll have counterparts in the Senate who can move bills, presumably. Have you had discussions with Shelby about areas where the House and the Senate can find common ground on either Dodd-Frank reforms, other areas of policy where there can be a confluence between the House and the Senate on financial services issues? And if you've had those conversations, what do they entail?
Well, I haven't directly had those conversations with Shelby, but those staff discussions have been ongoing under the assumption that there is a Republican Senate and Richard Shelby returns to the chairmanship on the Banking Committee. And so it's a question of coordination. We've passed quite a litany of reforms to Dodd-Frank and changes to Dodd-Frank. And so we've got to make sure that what we do meshes nicely with what the Senate Republicans want to do and the actions that they think they can take across the Senate floor. And so it's a matter of just prioritizing at this point because we certainly have the menu that we've been able to act upon in the House as a basis for these discussions. So I think we'll have that solidified before opening day.
Yeah, and do you think there's anything on Dodd-Frank that the president would actually agree to in terms of changes to that law? I mean, the general approach has been absolute defense of it, even if there are people inside the administration who believe that there are common sense changes, particularly to areas that would impact smaller financial institutions, community financial institutions. The danger in allowing any of that would mean open season on the whole bill. If you could pick out one or two things you think there's a prayer the president might agree to, what would they be that would help smaller financial institutions or larger ones, anything that is impacted by Dodd-Frank?
Well, look at the question of the Collins Amendment. Passed through a Democrat Senate. That's the first change, first substantive change to Dodd-Frank the Senate Democrats have passed.
Maybe to remind the audience what the Collins Amendment
this deals with insurance capital standards. And so the idea that insurance companies should have like-kind capital standards as banks have, which I don't think is what any of us want because insurance companies have to look at 30, 50 years out to match up their assets with their potential liabilities. And so that's the first change that they've passed in the Senate. We've passed a handful of changes with large bipartisan majorities. The question of the collateralized loan obligations, a regulatory change there. The question of points and fees when it comes to mortgages, and ensuring that SEC and the CFTC coordinate when it comes to rulemaking. And we passed those items with substantial majorities. I mean, overwhelming, only a handful of dissenting votes when you add them all together. So we packaged those things up. We passed it under a suspension with greater than a 2/3 vote off the House floor and sent it over to the Senate. So we'll see what the Senate does in the 2 weeks in December, whether or not they can process that, because Democrats in the House, especially on the House Financial Services Committee, a majority of the Democrats on the House Financial Services voted for all of those items. So hopefully they'll be able to process that. Yeah. And then we'll see if the president can come around to it. But at the very least, Collins, I think, is the soft entry point here.
Right.
And the question for me is what changes can we get my Democrat colleagues to go along with when it comes to Dodd-Frank? It's probably not going to be revolutionary, but certainly transparency is one. the SIFI designation process is deeply problematic and really open for a real strike at it in terms of the courts. But there are some responsible things we can do to provide some clarity to that designation process and ensure that traditional legal frameworks for rulemaking is abided by the FSOC.
Yeah, there's a lot of that I'd like to get into, but we could get really deep in the weeds quickly on MetLife designation, that sort of thing, and I want to get to...
Happy to.
Yeah, we have 22 minutes, and I don't want to put people to sleep, so let's talk about GSE reform. That never puts anyone to sleep. Because it just happens so naturally and easily. We get housing market finance reform and just snap your fingers and it happens. But I want to talk specifically about the Hensarling bill that never got a vote on the House floor. Will you push again for that bill to get a vote on the House floor in the next Congress? Why didn't it get one? Is it just dead in the water and you should move on to something else that retains more of a role for the federal government in backstopping the mortgage market?
I've only been in House leadership for the last 6 months. So those discussions about the PATH Act were before my time in House leadership. I still serve on the Financial Services Committee and supported the PATH Act. What's clear is we do have to have housing finance reform. Letting Fannie and Freddie exist as they currently are is not responsible to the taxpayers. It is not the right thing for our long-term budget prospects and the certainty for the housing market as well. With that, again, it goes back to this question of coordination with the Senate. And with a Republican Senate, perhaps the PATH Act would look different next Congress. And I think that Chairman Hensarling is working through those discussions with his Senate counterparts to see what you can actually get on the president's desk. And the other question for this is that the president's only put out, he's put out 3 different proposals, a discussion draft, if you will, and the 3 Little Bears proposal or whatever, which said absolutely nothing about the administration's position.
Right.
If the administration wants to have housing finance reform, they need to engage, and then I think we can see something productive come about there. With a Democrat president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, I think that's a good ingredient if there is the will to do it.
Yeah. Let's lighten it up a little bit and learn a little bit more about the Patrick McHenry story. Tell us a little bit about how you came to a life in politics, and then I want to find out a little bit about what your job as Chief Deputy Whip means, what it is that you do in that role. But tell us a little bit about your background, where you came from, how you decided to get involved in politics, and why you made that terribly bad decision to do that.
Well, it's my grandmother said one Thanksgiving when I was in college and just sort of a volunteer and interested in politics. She said over Thanksgiving dinner, she said, "I'm just so grateful. No one in our family has ever run for elective office." Right?
and you destroyed all her dreams.
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's very uplifting, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. No, I'm just teasing you.
So, and this is in the middle of sort of the Clinton scandals and everything else. So she said this, and I said, "Well, why, Grandma?" She says, "Oh, you just never know what skeletons are in the family closet, and I don't want to find out." Well, I'm glad I'm just an obscure member of Congress.
You're in the leadership now. You're not obscure at all. And I'm not, you might think that I'm like checking Twitter or my texts. I'm not. I'm trying to find Twitter questions on my phone. So that's the only reason that I brought this up.
All right.
Yeah, I'm not.
It's all right.
Tweeting.
So he's got the new iPhone, which is like holding a full-size iPad in my hands.
Yeah.
Seems like, seriously, look at this. Now you don't see me.
You can have,
so, anyway.
Don't look at my wife's text.
There you go.
All right, sorry, I interrupted you.
So anyway, I grew up in a family that was apolitical, and my father started a small business in our backyard using a credit card to buy a second piece of machinery. And so I grew up around that idea of a small business and families being involved and sort of lifting so that we can actually be more prosperous. And so those sort of kitchen table economics were the discussion of the day in the family. Mm-hmm. And so my father's sort of not very opinionated, just a guy who wanted to run a good business, and my mother was highly opinionated and also very short. So you can see who I tended after. So I think I get my opinionated nature from my mother, and certainly my extraordinary stature from her as well. So just growing up in a small town in the suburbs of Charlotte, that was sort of my perspective. And I think I got involved in politics really because I saw people doing in elective office things that I didn't want them to be doing. And so that's why I got engaged in the process.
And tell us about your sort of rise to the leadership and what your role is now as Chief Deputy Whip. What do you, I mean, obviously, you break out the whip and you get people in line like Kramer did in Seinfeld, but tell us about that job. What does that job entail?
Well, I got elected in 2004 and I was the youngest member of Congress. And for the first 3 years, I picked every fight I possibly could in the House. Didn't really focus on a small area of policy. I just decided I was going to fight the fight. Yeah. And so for the first 3 years, I learned a lot of tough lessons. And I tell new members that are trying to figure this process out, I said, well, for the first 3 years, I had to figure out what to do by doing everything you shouldn't do, right? And so after that, I've spent the last 7 years focused almost entirely on financial service policy. And my focus was to be an effective committee member who was engaged in policy and a very small subject area in financial services. That led to my involvement with the Jobs Act and with equity crowdfunding. So that's been my focus, and so the end game for me in the House was always been the chairmanship of the Financial Services Committee, and then after Eric Cantor lost, we had a very hard-fought race for whip, and I supported my friend Steve Scalise because I thought he'd just be an excellent whip. Just has a real understanding of policy, real understanding where our members are. And has wonderful relationships. Just his style is just perfect to work with people and to bring them along and to actually find a cohesive strategy for House Republicans. So I support him. Worked very hard for him on his campaign, and the reward I thought was having an ally and friend as whip. Right. Losing Eric Cantor was a devastating loss for the conference and for me personally because I'm personally very close to Eric. And so I thought it'd be great to replace a friend with a friend in leadership. And then press reports said that he was considering me for Chief Deputy Whip, which I had never spoken to him about. And then a couple days after the election, he called me into his office and made the offer, which I was fairly shocked about.
Right. Lo and behold, press reports for once were actually accurate in this.
Yeah, it's crazy. Politico is accurate, right?
Yeah, we got it right. I'm sure we got it first too. I'm sure Jake Sherman had that scoop. There's no question in my mind, or Braz or somebody at Politico. I want to get back into a couple of financial services issues that we didn't touch on, and one of them that's sort of on my mind is how the Republican Congress in the next Congress will approach Fed oversight. There's a lot of desire for more transparency. Audit bills obviously are going to be under consideration. What is the approach that you will take on House Financial Services and then more broadly in the Republican Congress to Fed oversight? And is there a danger at over-politicizing the Fed, particularly at a time when it's going to be attempting to normalize the interest rate environment, a tricky balance for Janet Yellen to get that right without letting inflation, which we don't see any signs of now, but if it materializes, get ahead of her. So how do you approach the Fed in the next Congress without over-politicizing it?
Well, I think it's clear that House Republicans want greater transparency, and there's a meeting of the minds when it comes to the right and the left in this country, that the Fed needs greater transparency, and we need to have greater certainty about our monetary policy going forward. I think it's based off of the extraordinary actions we've seen the Federal Reserve take since the crisis. And this is a reaction because my constituents know much more about Fed policy now than they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Actually, more than they knew 6 years ago or 10 years ago, pre-crisis or greater than that. And so this is a reaction to what our constituents are talking about. And so we will be aggressive, but there's a way to be thoughtful and aggressive. The Fed has their 100-year anniversary since their founding. So I think it's right that we, from time to time, adjust those mechanisms that we put in place in law. And that means sort of the balancing of who's on the monetary policy, the Open Markets Committee, who sets monetary policy for our country. They made changes in the first 20 years after the Federal Reserve was put in place to rebalance who's on the Open Markets Committee and the structure of it. In the first generation of the Fed's founding, the Treasury Secretary was on the Monetary Policy Committee there, which they saw as problematic later. So I think from time to time it is appropriate for us to take a look at the Fed and its structure. That doesn't mean politicizing it, because I think we have very fine, very capable, very smart individuals who are at the Federal Reserve making good decisions, making sound decisions. Even if I don't agree with them in their process necessarily, I think that we have very high caliber people and we want to keep that going. But simply to give them more power as a result of Dodd-Frank without reviewing their process is really not responsible either. And so
You're talking about their oversight authority and their regulatory authority
Right.
as increased under Dodd-Frank.
Significantly. And then the questions about their conversations setting sort of international standards as well for banks and financial institutions, and whether or not there's some transparency there. And so they've entered into a more political realm in some respects as a result of Dodd-Frank. And so checking that, I think, is appropriate. I think Dodd-Frank gave the Federal Reserve a number of powers that they should not rightfully have, that will diminish their institution and make it more challenging for them to be independent going forward. And I think we need to review those things and make sure that they're put in place with more of the political class and more of the presidential appointees for the independent agencies rather than the Federal Reserve Board.
And how about the CFPB in the next Congress? How will you approach oversight there? And are there specific reforms you could push that you think could actually get enacted? I know the big question in the past has been its funding stream and changing it from the way it is now to a different leadership structure. Are there any things that you could actually realistically get done to change the CFPB?
That's a question for the Senate.
Yeah.
Because in the House, we can pass any change to the CFPB, and there's a clear majority and some Democrats who will vote for those changes.
Yeah.
And the Senate, it's next Congress, it'll be a question not of 54 Republicans, though potentially.
Yeah.
It'll be the question of 6 Democrats coming along for any of those policy changes. I'll leave that to Chairman Shelby to work his magic.
You can prognosticate for us a little bit. I mean, one would think that there would be 6 Democrats, moderate Democrats with financial services, constituents who would favor some of these changes. Do you think it's likely that we would see some things out of the Senate that would get to the president's desk?
Well, I think it would be interesting to see if a senator from Massachusetts looks at the discrimination and the incompetence of how the agency is currently being run and think that something needs to change. Because the senator from a senator from Massachusetts did a significant amount of hiring for those individuals who clearly have a problem with the structure of it in terms of the number of discrimination claims is fairly extraordinary for an agency that is so new. They have a problematic relationship with the union. The leadership does, the union of the CFPB employees. There are a number of problems that need to be addressed. The question is, how far will Democrats go in making some of those reforms and changes that otherwise won't occur without their engagement? We need to have those discussions, and we need to continue those discussions next Congress.
We talked a little bit backstage about the likelihood of some of those changes happening in the context of a broader government funding bill. I mean, are there ways to get the changes that you want into legislation that the president presumably would have a hard time vetoing? Is that a strategy that you would approve of and that could
Absolutely.
be effective? Yeah. What would you put in there? Like, say we've got a funding bill that's going to go to the president at the cusp of a government shutdown. You have the opportunity, you pass through the House, the Senate takes up what?
Well, that's much more about the Senate rules on what can be included on a circumstance like that. But I think certainly making sure they're back on budget would be a very responsible thing. A bipartisan board would be a responsible thing. These aren't revolutionary changes. They don't really change the substance of the agency, but will make them far more accountable. Just look at the mess in terms of their building and their changes they're making to the building. It's clear that they really don't care the cost of that simply because they send a letter over to the Federal Reserve and say, we need this money. Without anyone at the Federal Reserve being able to say no, and without an inspector general there to even effectively check them in terms of disclosing to the public what's going on. So I think just a few small changes will be achieved this next Congress, but they will fundamentally make the agency. They'll make the agency fundamentally more accountable than it currently is. Not revolutionary, but much more accountable.
You could see a scenario under which the president would sign a bill that changed the leadership structure of the CFPB to a board.
I have no great insight what this president will or won't do.
Yeah. Well, I guess a lot of us don't have that
No.
either. Let's talk about some other big picture issues that the next Congress will attempt to handle. One of the foremost for the business community being corporate tax reform, and there's still some hope that you could find common ground there, although obviously, there are great challenges to getting that done in terms of the revenue impact, in terms of what tax provisions you would eliminate, loopholes you would eliminate. Give us your forecast for the likelihood that something could get done, and if it could get done, what would it look like?
Well, the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is a fellow by the name of Paul Ryan.
I think we've heard of him.
If you're not familiar with him, he's a congressman from Wisconsin.
He's got nice hair.
Yes, a wonderful hair,
Yeah.
fantastic helmet of hair.
Yeah.
So he's the new incoming chairman for the Ways and Means Committee, and Orrin Hatch is the incoming chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. We have to have they're beginning those discussions on what the structure of tax reform would look like, so they can actually build out a plan that could get bipartisan support and the president could come along with. I think tax reform is quite a challenge to get across the finish line. This president is going to have to make it a priority. He's going to have to engage in the Hill. With the Hill, he traditionally hasn't done that. He really barely did it when Democrats were in the majority in the House and the Senate, and has been next to invisible in terms of lobbying on Capitol Hill for his priorities. And so he's going to have a change of heart about this and make it a priority and engage. If he does that, I think we have a real opportunity for fundamental tax reform in the second, third, fourth quarter of next year. I'm actually...
Second, third, and fourth quarter of next year being just as we're heading into the 2016 presidential cycle, you think corporate tax reform could get done in that context?
I'm optimistic.
You're optimistic. So you say they don't have to start from scratch, right? Can they pick up from Camp and Baucus what they put together and build off of that, or are we just starting from square one?
I think they need to start from square one.
Yeah.
I think what Dave Camp, what Chairman Camp did was a very honorable thing, very intellectually sound document. I had some problems with a number of provisions with it, and I expressed those disagreements, in particular about the bank tax that's included, because I believe that's a lending tax in the structure of it, because it was based off of bank assets. Right. Bank assets are loans by nature. And so I believe that was a lending tax, and so I expressed that to him. But I don't think that the incoming chairman of the Senate Finance Committee or the incoming chairman of the Ways and Means Committee have to accept that as a baseline to begin the discussions. I think there are components of that that they certainly can use, but I don't think you have to. You don't have to use some of the basic things: static scoring, distributionally neutral. Those assumptions that Chairman Camp had to use.
Yeah, you would prefer a dynamic scoring
approach. I think so.
approach
I
to
think
it.
we have to look at that.
Okay. I want to take a couple of quick audience questions before we wrap up, but the one thing I wanted to ask on corporate tax reform on the bank tax issue. Can you do it without some sort of bank tax? Presumably if you lower the overall rate, banks are going to have a huge windfall from that, which might make it unpalatable to get it through with any Democratic support. Is there another structure of a bank tax that could work that's not a tax on lending, that's not noxious to you?
Well, like I said, I mean, if you're taxing bank assets, simply by its nature, you're taxing loans. Those things, those are really liabilities in the real economy, right? So I think that structure doesn't work. The assumption you've just made and assumed in your question is that banks currently pay a very high marginal tax rate, much higher than a number of Fortune 500 companies that are in the industrial space and the manufacturing space, where we really need to be competitive. And so I don't think that that's a problem that with lower rates, certain institutions pay more or less. I don't think that's really a matter of public policy. I think we need to set the rate based on what our government needs and the competitive nature of the global environment that we're competing in.
I'm just thinking of the Democrats saying, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are getting X amount of tax breaks from this. We can't possibly support it. We're running out of time, and I see a mic right here. So let's take one or two audience questions if someone has a burning desire to ask a question to the Deputy Whip. Nobody has any questions for him. I can certainly continue with a couple of final thoughts.
Those are fantastic questions. Thank you.
Yeah. This is the kind of thing he likes. Let's talk about 2016 quickly, since it's coming upon us quickly. The financial services community has indicated a desire to see Jeb Bush run for president. A lot of folks that I talk to, if he doesn't, there's some other people on the list. Do you have a favorite candidate for 2016, and would your friend Paul Ryan consider getting in this mix, or is Ways and Means it for him and he's got his dream job
No,
right
I think
now?
Paul should consider it. I think the field is wide open. I think Paul has a unique voice and would be he showed that he was a credible candidate in the short run for vice president. And he's shown it in his work in the House. He has a very unique voice that he can carry out, and I think he should very sincerely consider running for president. And I would support him.
Okay.
I don't think that changes his dynamics, the fact that one guy from North Carolina supports him. But Mark Walker is a new freshman from North Carolina, member of Congress. Scott Walker from Wisconsin,
another Wisconsin
governor,
right.
Would be a great candidate. Jeb would be a great candidate as well. And then Rand Paul. Those are all folks that have very unique perspectives and voices, and I don't really have a favorite among them, but I kind of listed my favorites.
Yes, okay, that's a good list. Our last question for you will be in the philosophical realm, and that is there's somewhat of a debate in the Republican Party about whether you need to be a governing party over the next 2 years or you need to be an opposition party to the president, even though you have both houses of Congress. What is your view on that? Do you need to enact several pieces of legislation between now and 2016, or do you need to present a united front against the president and then hope to have full control of the government in 2017 after the presidential race?
We can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
That's Boehner's favorite phrase, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is very true. We can actually do the responsible things we need to do now and lay out our vision for the future. If we lay out our vision for the future, it doesn't mean changes to Dodd-Frank. It means a fundamental reordering of how our capital markets function and with a global view of competition and what an ideal capital market structure would look like. But in the meantime, there are some responsible things we can do to change Dodd-Frank that are good for the markets, good for stability, and good for lending, and good for my constituents. Likewise with health care. Obamacare is a disaster, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean we can't make changes that will help my constituents in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, and help families across America. When it comes to energy policy, we want an all-of-the-above approach for House Republicans. The president really doesn't care about that. Look at the Keystone Pipeline issue, okay? But we can approve Keystone and lay out our vision for what energy policy should look like over the long term, and if we're given the reins of power, this is what we would implement. I think those things, and that's before you even talk about education, responsible changes we can do for worker training programs. My colleague Virginia Fox passed and got signed by the president a huge change to worker retraining programs, unifying a number of these programs and reducing the number, making them more effective. That's responsible. Over the long term, we can lay out our vision for ensuring that parents and families have more choices and more opportunities for education and training in this country, and not simply have a discussion about debt on getting a college education, but the meaning of that college education, the effectiveness, and what kind of jobs it will get you, and the opportunities it will present you if you have a good, productive higher education experience. And so we have to have these larger discussions, but in the meantime, we have to do those singles and doubles of daily congressional life that will make my constituents' life better and Americans' lives better.
I'll tell you what, make all of our lives better is hit a double and don't give us a shutdown over Christmas. Congressman McHenry, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out.
Thanks.